Anne Boleyn's execution was far more horrifying than you think. They say power protects you, that crowns come with safety, that queens are untouchable. But Anne Boleyn? She discovered the truth far too late. That in Henry VIII's court, silence was the deadliest sentence of all. There was no announcement, no angry confrontation, no warning, just a sudden, unbearable stillness. The once adored queen, whose wit, beauty, and defiance had changed the course of English history, was now being unspoken. Whispers replaced greetings. Doors that once opened for her now quietly closed. Even the king, her husband, refused to look her in the eye. It began during the May Day celebrations of 1536. One moment, Anne was watching the jousts, smiling from the royal balcony. The next, her world fractured. Mid-festival, Henry abruptly left, abandoning her in front of the court. By the time she returned to her chambers, her fate was already sealed. Guards arrived not with violence, but with chilling precision. They tore through her private belongings, letters, keepsakes, even prayer books, searching for proof of crimes no one could define. And while Anne sat helpless, her servants, those closest to her, were hauled away and interrogated like traitors. This wasn't justice, it was erasure, a slow, calculated unraveling of a queen's reality before a single charge had even been spoken. In Tudor England, executions didn't begin with a sword. They began with a whisper and ended with a silence so loud it shook the very foundations of the crown. This is the story of how Anne Boleyn died long before the blade ever touched her neck, and why her final days remain one of the most chilling, politically brutal downfalls in royal history. Brace yourself. It gets worse from here. Ready to uncover the dark truth? Drop "I'm ready" below, like, subscribe, and stay tuned. This story's just getting started. Once Anne Boleyn was arrested, the full machinery of Tudor injustice began to grind into motion, not with clarity, but with chaos dressed in official robes. There were no obvious crimes, no blood-stained weapons, or discovered plots. So the court built its case out of shadows, whispers, and glances. They didn't just look at what Anne had done, they looked at how others looked at her. Servants, bodyguards, musicians, people with no power were dragged into dark chambers and questioned about what they saw in her face, in her smile, in the way someone laughed near her in a corridor. A raised eyebrow, a soft word. Even silence became dangerous. Facial expressions were treated like daggers. The tone of someone's voice in Anne's presence, too warm, too amused, too familiar, was enough to raise suspicion. And once suspicion was raised, it didn't need to be proven, it only needed to be written down. Anne's everyday life was pulled apart piece by piece, and from it they created a myth of a wicked queen surrounded by lustful, treacherous men. The very people who served her food, who lit candles in her room, who tuned her lute, were now labeled as lovers or accomplices. The dates listed for her alleged adultery were so ridiculous they bordered on farce. One charge claimed she had betrayed the king while she was recovering from childbirth, a time when she would have been physically weak, in pain, and closely watched. Another claimed she had seduced a man just days after a miscarriage, when she was bedridden and barely able to stand. The absurdity didn't matter. What mattered was building a case that sounded dangerous enough to justify her death. They needed names, so they gave her lovers, and they chose them not by evidence, but by proximity. Who spoke to her often? Who shared meals or passed her notes from other courtiers? That was enough. Familiarity was turned into guilt. One man's downfall came because he once caught her eye during a dance. Another because he carried a message to her from her father. It didn't matter what was said, only that something had passed between them. Among the most disturbing accusations was the one against her own brother, George Boleyn. It wasn't enough to charge Anne with adultery, they needed to make it horrifying. So they added incest. They claimed she had slept with George, though no proof existed. They said he had read books that were banned by the church. Not books about rebellion or magic, but books questioning religious traditions, books that Henry himself had once supported when it suited him. Now, those same ideas were being used as evidence of treason. The list of charges wasn't filled with facts, it was filled with feelings. Words like fantasies and plots were written into official records as if a thought or a fear could be put on trial. They claimed Anne had imagined things, that she had dreamed of the king's death, not said it, not written it, merely thought it. In Tudor England, that was enough to kill you. This was not a trial about law, it was about fear, image, and control. The king needed a clean break, a story the people would believe. So Anne wasn't just accused, she was reshaped, twisted into a figure of corruption and poison. Her mind, her body, her very presence, everything was turned into something dangerous. And so, before she even stepped into a courtroom, the world had already been taught to see her not as a queen, not even as a woman, but as a threat that needed to be erased. Anne Boleyn's imprisonment did not begin with iron chains or harsh beatings. It began with careful design. Every detail of her environment was chosen to strip her of identity, power, and sanity. Her cell was not in the tower's dark dungeons, but in what had once been a queen's apartment. An eerie irony. It was a space once meant for grace and celebration, now emptied of its warmth and purpose. The walls, once decorated with rich fabrics and symbols of royal dignity, were bare. The windows, small and grimy, let in very little light. The chill inside the stone walls was constant. And yet, this wasn't about discomfort alone. It was about contrast. To be locked inside the memory of her own former life was a torment in itself. The room reminded her every second that she had fallen. The crown she once wore had not just been taken, it had been erased. Guards stood outside her door, but they were not familiar palace men in Tudor livery. They wore no royal emblems, no colors of the court. Their uniforms were stripped of identity. They did not speak to her, not even when they changed shifts. This silence was no accident, it was a strategy. It created the sense that time wasn't passing, that no one human was nearby, that she wasn't being watched by people, but by shadows. This silent rotation of faceless figures dissolved any sense of safety or recognition. Even her jailers became a form of psychological pressure. She was not allowed to see her daughter, the young Elizabeth, nor was she allowed to send messages to the outside world. Being cut off from her child was perhaps the deepest wound. Elizabeth had been a source of pride and love. Anne had fought so hard to protect her future. Now she was treated as if she never existed. To be a mother and not be able to speak, write, or even hear a whisper about your child is its own form of torture. It wasn't just physical separation, it was emotional amputation. Anne was being told, day after day, that her love no longer had a place, that her identity as a mother, something no court could take by law, could still be stolen in practice. There was no clock on the wall, no candle measured by hour, no servant to mark the passing of morning or night. Without a calendar or any timekeeping device, Anne had no way of knowing how long she had been imprisoned or how much time she had left. Sleep came and went in fits. Light outside shifted unpredictably. This wasn't about saving resources. It was about taking away one of the most basic structures the human mind needs: time. Without it, the mind can slip. Days feel endless or vanish in a blur. She couldn't count down the hours to her trial or find stability in routine. Each moment stretched unnaturally, making her more vulnerable to fear and despair. Her meals added to the confusion. They came at odd hours, sometimes too early, sometimes very late. The portions varied. One day a rich stew, the next a piece of stale bread. Not enough to starve her, but enough to remove rhythm and expectation. Meals had always been ceremonial in the royal household, part of a daily structure. Now they were tools of unpredictability. This small but deliberate inconsistency slowly chipped away at her sense of control. She couldn't plan, couldn't predict, couldn't trust even the simplest human need to remain consistent. This was not chaos. It was control disguised as chaos. Her surroundings were engineered to make her feel forgotten by the world and lost to herself. The walls didn't just hold her in, they reached into her mind, pulling apart the very sense of who she was. Long before Anne Boleyn stood trial, her guilt had already been decided in the eyes of the public. It wasn't just whispered rumors or court gossip. It was a carefully planned campaign executed with the full force of Tudor propaganda. Across London, printed broadsheets began to appear. These were the 16th century version of newspapers, single pages covered in bold ink, hung in taverns, marketplaces, and street corners. They didn't report facts. They reported shame. Anne was painted as a woman of corruption, lust, and betrayal, accused not by a court, but by the city itself. These pages used dramatic words and exaggerated language to make her sound like a dangerous force that had threatened the stability of the realm. For most people reading them, the message was simple: this queen had to go. At the same time, a strange sermon was staged near the Tower of London, not inside a church, but in public view, as if it were theater. The preacher didn't mention Anne by name, but his words were clear to all who listened. He spoke about the dangers of female ambition, warning that when women overstepped their roles, disaster followed. He quoted scripture and spoke with the heavy weight of divine authority, making it sound as if Anne's downfall wasn't just political, it was a punishment from God. This sermon wasn't spontaneous, it was staged, placed where the crowd could gather and hear. It gave moral permission to those who wanted to see her fall. Court poets soon joined the effort. Under royal sponsorship, they composed verses that twisted Anne's rise into a cautionary tale. She had been portrayed as a woman of wit and elegance just a few years earlier. Now she was cast as a serpent, a seductress, a symbol of disorder. These poems didn't stay within the walls of the palace. They were copied and shared, recited in court gatherings, and handed down through households. Verse was a powerful tool in a mostly illiterate society. People remembered poems more than speeches. And these verses made sure the memory of Anne was poisoned before her fate was sealed. Even as Anne remained locked away, Henry VIII made his next move loudly and in public. He appeared with Jane Seymour, the woman who would soon become his third wife. They didn't hide their connection. In fact, Henry had her join him on a grand royal barge, floating down the river while the city watched. It was a message to all. The king had already moved on. This display wasn't just disrespectful, it was part of a calculated plan to make Anne look like the past, while Jane represented the future. By showing the new queen before the old one was even condemned, Henry rewrote the story in real time. Behind closed doors, the King's Council was already working on matters they claimed hadn't happened yet. They met to draft plans for the line of succession, making decisions about the crown, as if Anne's trial was just a formality. They discussed Elizabeth's position and the elevation of Jane Seymour's possible children, all before Anne had even spoken a word in court. These meetings revealed that her fall wasn't a response to crime, it was a replacement strategy. The machinery of power had moved on without her. In Tudor England, truth didn't matter as much as timing and presentation. By the time Anne's trial began, her name had been turned into a warning, her voice drowned out by pre-written judgment, and her downfall packaged as justice served by a higher order. Anne Boleyn was no longer treated like a queen. In her final hours, she was staged like a symbol, part punishment, part warning, and part theater. Every detail of her appearance and surroundings was chosen to deliver a message, not just to those watching, but to history itself. Even her clothing spoke volumes. Anne wore a plain gray gown with deep crimson sleeves. It was not her choice, but a costume selected for her. Gray signified humility, perhaps even shame. Crimson, the color of blood, reminded the onlookers of what was about to happen. It wasn't just about dressing her for death. It was about dressing her to send a signal. This was the end of a sinful woman, not a royal figure. She was made to look like a sinner begging forgiveness, not a queen facing injustice. The scaffold itself was unusual. Normally, it was built high above the crowd, a clear platform that gave the condemned some final dignity and distance. But not for Anne. The platform was built deliberately low. She had to stoop to climb it, forcing her body into an undignified shape in front of a watching crowd. The effect was both practical and cruel. She looked small, exposed, and vulnerable. The message was again clear. This woman, once crowned and celebrated, now had to bow before death. It wasn't just an execution, it was visual punishment, a theatrical moment designed to strip her of every ounce of majesty she once carried. As the scaffold was prepared, the audience was carefully selected. Foreign ambassadors were invited and given places of prominence. Their job was to watch and write. Henry VIII wanted the world to see that this wasn't a messy personal matter. It was justice. By inviting these witnesses, he turned Anne's execution into a kind of international press release. What they saw would be repeated in letters and reports sent across Europe. Her death became propaganda used to justify Henry's actions, not just in England, but on the broader stage of European politics. Even in death, Anne was used to serve a political purpose. The final act of stripping her of humanity came in the silence. Her ladies-in-waiting, the women who had once dressed her for coronation and courtly events, were ordered to help her prepare for death, but they were not allowed to speak. No prayers, no final words, no gentle goodbye. They could help her fasten the gown, tie her headdress, and remove her jewelry, but they had to do it in silence. This rule may seem small, but it carried enormous weight. It denied Anne the basic comfort of companionship and affection in her final hour. She was surrounded by people who cared for her, but they were turned into mute shadows. The ritual of death was done with quiet hands and heavy hearts, but no sound. She was isolated even as she was touched. And then there was the crowd. For most executions of high-born nobles, distance was maintained. The public might gather in large numbers, but they were held back. For Anne, that rule was ignored. The crowd was allowed to press in closer than usual, so near they could see the tears in her eyes and hear her voice tremble. The effect was disturbing, a kind of forced intimacy between the dying queen and her witnesses. It made her final moments raw and exposed. People did not just hear of her execution, they felt as if they had stood with her. It was a strange kind of closeness, not built on compassion, but on spectacle. The queen's last breath wasn't private. It was consumed by the crowd. The man chosen to end Anne Boleyn's life was not English. He was a skilled swordsman from France, specially brought in at Henry VIII's request. This wasn't out of kindness, though some would later argue the sword was swifter than the axe. It was, instead, another layer of pageantry, another tool to make Anne's death both theatrical and controlled. But what made this man even more eerie than his blade was his silence. He never spoke Anne's name, not before the execution, not during it, not even in the moments just before he struck. In a way, that silence was louder than words. To not address her directly was to strip away her humanity, to deny her personhood. In that moment, she was no longer Queen Anne. She was just a body waiting to fall. The executioner was said to have spent days in the Tower of London before the act, but not with Anne. He never met her. He trained instead on sacks filled with grain, mimicking the height and size of the human neck. He practiced swing after swing until the motion was flawless. Every movement rehearsed, every muscle memory sharpened. It was not preparation for mercy, it was preparation for spectacle. Her death was being rehearsed like a final performance, not a human ending, but a display of precision. It became less about ending a life and more about executing a task with practiced perfection. And yet, when the moment finally came, Anne never saw it. Not really. The executioner used a tactic reportedly meant to distract her. As she knelt, waiting, he shouted, "Bring me the sword!" in the opposite direction. It was a command she likely didn't expect. Perhaps she turned slightly or shifted her eyes. And in that split second, while her gaze moved away, the sword came down. It was over before she could realize it. This trick wasn't done out of cruelty, but it had a coldness to it. a final act of deception, even in death. She had been deceived in life by promises, in trial by lies, and now, at the very end, by the very man ending it all. But the horror didn't stop with the fall of the blade. According to reports from those who stood nearby, her lips still moved, her eyes blinked, once, then again. Some said she seemed aware, just for a heartbeat longer than should have been possible. It's debated whether this was real or imagined in the shock of the moment. But for those who saw it, the image stayed with them. A severed head, the eyes fluttering open as if trying to understand. The line between life and death suddenly blurred. It turned a clean cut into something haunting, something unforgettable. After it was done, the executioner didn't linger. He left England immediately, paid for his work, but shadowed by its memory. He never spoke about Anne Boleyn again, not in public, not in confession, not even in rumor. For a man who played such a central role in one of the most famous deaths in history, he vanished quickly and quietly. Whatever thoughts he had, whatever weight he carried, he took with him across the channel and into silence. Perhaps he understood something others did not, that what he ended wasn't just a life, but an entire chapter of history. And that kind of knowledge carries a burden too great for words. When Anne Boleyn died, it wasn't just her body that was taken. It was her dignity, her faith, and the sacred rituals that had once confirmed her as queen. In death, she was treated not as royalty, not even as nobility, but as something quietly discarded. One of the most jarring omissions was the absence of a priest. In Tudor England, even commoners received final rites before execution. For a queen to be denied the presence of a priest was not just an oversight, it was a deliberate act of spiritual erasure. Anne was left to face death without the last holy words that might have comforted her, forgiven her, or offered her soul safe passage. In a time when the Church ruled the rhythm of life and death, this was no small thing. It was a message the state had stripped her not just of title, but of salvation. After the blade had fallen and the crowd had gasped, the scene did not shift into solemnity. It fell into silence. Her body, now lifeless and without honor, was not taken up by royal hands or respected officials. It was her own ladies-in-waiting, heartbroken and trembling, who were left to collect her remains. They had been with her in life, and now, in grief, they performed the last sacred duty. No guards stepped forward, no courtly officials issued orders. It was up to those few loyal women, crying as they moved, to lift her severed head and her body, wrap them in cloth, and prepare them as best they could without resources or guidance. No royal physician attended, no herald announced her passing. Worse still, there was no coffin waiting. Nothing had been prepared, as if even in her final hour she didn't deserve forethought. Instead, her remains were placed in an old wooden arrow chest. A box used for weapons now held the body of a queen. It was too small and poorly fitted for a human body, let alone one of her stature. This choice, if it was a choice, was not just careless, it was cruel. Anne had once sat on a throne, wore velvet and gold, and now her last bed was a splintered crate made for war. The burial came fast. There was no procession, no prayers sung aloud, no bells rung in mourning. Anne Boleyn was buried within just a few hours of her execution. They placed her in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the Tower grounds. But even there, no marker was laid to show who rested beneath the stones. She was buried in the same ground as traitors and prisoners, without a name, without a date, without dignity. Visitors would pass over her grave for centuries without knowing. Her memory was buried along with her. Perhaps most chilling of all, life at court did not pause. No day of mourning was declared. There were no black banners hung in the great halls. No court musicians were silenced. In fact, officials were given instructions to return to their duties and continue with the royal festivities almost immediately. Less than 24 hours later, King Henry VIII was said to be preparing for his next wedding. Laughter echoed through the palace as if nothing had happened at all. Anne Boleyn's death wasn't just quiet, it was deliberately buried under noise. By denying her ritual, denying her dignity, and denying the space to grieve, the crown didn't just kill Anne, it tried to erase her. After Anne Boleyn was gone, the silence was not accidental. It was planned, commanded, and enforced. Her death did not leave behind echoes. It left a forced stillness, as though the palace had swallowed her whole and sealed its lips. The order came down quietly, but firmly. Royal musicians were never to play her favorite songs again. These were tunes she once requested during meals, during court gatherings, and in her private moments. Music had followed Anne like a shadow, part of her charm and presence. But now those melodies were silenced forever. They were not just forbidden, they were erased. If a court musician so much as hummed one by accident, they risked punishment. It wasn't enough that Anne was gone. The very sound of her memory had to be hunted down and hushed. Next came the visual erasure. Anne's face had once appeared everywhere, in framed portraits in the halls of Whitehall, embroidered into tapestries, even painted on plates used during royal banquets. But after her death, royal workers were assigned to destroy or change any portrait that showed her image. Some were burned, others were painted over with red and gold, the colors of the Tudor dynasty, but not hers. In some cases, her face was replaced by that of Jane Seymour, Henry's soon-to-be new queen. One day Anne was everywhere. The next, it was as if she had never been queen at all. The walls of power no longer bore witness to her. The purge didn't stop at paintings. Even the written word became dangerous. Private letters between courtiers, especially those written during Anne's time as queen, were searched. If her name appeared, the letters were seized. Servants were questioned. Some nobles burned their own correspondence in fear of being tied too closely to her memory. Conversations that once flowed freely now slowed into whispers or stopped entirely. People became afraid to speak, even in private, because Anne's name had become poison. To speak it aloud was to risk your position, or worse, your freedom. Meanwhile, her daughter Elizabeth, once dressed in royal silks and surrounded by attendants, faced her own quiet punishment. Overnight, Elizabeth's household changed. The fine clothes disappeared. The royal crest was stripped from her belongings. Her nurses and tutors were dismissed without warning. Even the way people addressed her changed. No longer was she Princess Elizabeth. She became simply Lady Elizabeth. She was barely 3 years old, yet her mother's death had already pushed her into political shadow. The child would grow up knowing her royal birth was a wound rather than a crown. Inside the king's chambers, another kind of silence was enforced. Henry VIII gave direct orders. No one was to speak of Anne. Her name was banned, not just formally, but emotionally. Those who had once served her, those who once toasted her at feasts, were expected to behave as if she had never existed. In meetings, in letters, even in idle gossip, Anne Boleyn was now a forbidden memory. It was a strange kind of death, not just of the body, but of identity, presence, and even memory itself. What followed her execution wasn't grief or mourning. It was removal, quiet, strategic, complete. In the world of Tudor politics, power could not simply destroy the person, it had to destroy the memory. And so silence fell, not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear. A silence so deep it echoed longer than the sword that struck her. The death of Anne Boleyn did not only destroy her, it unsettled everyone who saw it happen. Her execution did not vanish quietly into the records. It lingered in the minds of those who stood nearby, those who served her, and those who had once called her queen. The trauma spread like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Lady Kingston, one of the noblewomen assigned to attend Anne in her final days, was haunted long after the blade fell. She kept a small journal, and in its worn pages were notes about sleepless nights and dreams filled with blood and shadows. Her entries did not describe the court or the politics. They spoke only of eyes that would not close, a voice that would not stop speaking even after death. The Queen's final words, Her quiet bravery and the way her body crumpled stayed with Lady Kingston like a curse. Others could not bear to stay. Some courtiers resigned quietly, handing in requests to serve abroad or take lesser roles far from the English court. One young nobleman asked to be posted in Ireland. Another took a position in Calais. They did not say outright that Anne's death was the reason, but everyone understood. The court had turned cold, full of watching eyes and unspoken grief. The atmosphere was thick with fear, with memories people didn't want to carry. In a world built on loyalty and silence, stepping away was the only escape left. Among the staff, the emotional damage was even sharper. One young maid, whose job had been to help prepare Anne on the morning of the execution, began showing signs of mental distress within months. She spoke to no one. She often wandered the gardens, whispering to herself, as if still hearing Anne's voice. A year later, she was taken to an institution for what they called visions. They said she was seeing things that weren't there, reliving the execution again and again. She had seen too much, heard too much. In a time when mental illness was poorly understood, her suffering became just another dark footnote to a darker event. Even outside the tower, Anne's death created waves. Among the noble families, arguments began, quiet at first, then louder. Husbands and wives who had once agreed on everything suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a deadly question. Was Anne guilty, or was she framed? Some believed the charges were lies, created to remove her. Others trusted the king's judgment without question. These differences tore at marriages. Some couples separated. Some sent their children to be raised in other households. In private letters and whispered conversations, Anne became not just a queen or a victim, but a dividing line between those who still believed in justice and those who had given up. Writers felt the shift too. For decades after Anne's death, poets and playwrights avoided mentioning her by name, not because she was forgotten, but because she was dangerous. Any story that even hinted at her fate risked drawing royal attention. The memory of her downfall was a forbidden fire. Everyone could feel its heat, but no one dared speak too close to it. Creative minds, who might have written tragedies or verses about her, stayed silent, protecting their futures by erasing her from their art. The silence in literature echoed the silence in the palace. Anne Boleyn's execution was not just a moment in time, it was a wound that bled into others. The fear it caused, the guilt it sparked, and the visions it left behind became a kind of ghost that haunted the lives of everyone who had seen her die. Though Anne Boleyn's life had ended in blood and silence, her presence never truly left the crown or her daughter. Elizabeth I, Anne's only surviving child, grew up in a world where her mother's name was forbidden. Yet the bond between them ran deep, even though they were torn apart before Elizabeth could form a memory. As queen, Elizabeth rarely spoke of Anne publicly, but those closest to her noticed one secret item she always kept near: a small locket ring, golden and delicate, with a hidden compartment. Inside was a tiny painted portrait of Anne, soft features, intelligent eyes, wearing the French hood she had made fashionable. This locket was Elizabeth's private rebellion. She wore it not to announce her mother's legacy to the world, but to carry her silently, like a heartbeat no one could hear but her. The Tower of London, where Anne had died, never forgot either. Over the years, guards spoke in hushed tones about a figure seen at dawn on certain cold mornings, a headless woman dressed in deep red, moving near the site of the old scaffold. Some claimed she walked without sound, her steps not touching the ground. Others said she paused as if waiting for something or someone. Whether the stories were real or imagined, they spread among the guards and servants like frost through stone. It was never just a ghost, it was a memory the tower could not shake. A queen whose final scream had sunk into the walls, leaving behind a shape of grief. Under Elizabeth's rule, England turned toward Protestantism. In secret gatherings, especially during the early years of her reign, some Protestant supporters spoke of Anne as more than a martyr. They saw her as a fallen flame whose daughter now carried the torch. In hidden circles, people whispered that Anne had died not just for love, but for change. Her execution became, in their eyes, a symbol of sacrifice against the old ways, against tyranny, against papal control. She was remembered in coded poems, in hidden symbols scratched into wooden pews, in private letters smuggled through cautious hands. Anne's ghost became a symbol of protest, not just a shadow in the tower, but a quiet force behind a queen who ruled with iron in her voice and fire in her eyes. Yet even with her power, Elizabeth never officially cleared her mother's name. She did not demand that history rewrite itself, nor did she force the court to sing Anne's praises. But she didn't need to. In the details of her reign, Elizabeth quietly lifted her mother from the mud. The royal motto she adopted, Semper Idem, meaning always the same, spoke to loyalty, legacy, and strength that endured, even in silence. She surrounded herself with symbols of the Tudor line, but made sure her own image, strong and unshaken, stood front and center. In that image, people could see echoes of Anne, the same dark eyes, the same fierce spirit. Elizabeth made herself a living monument, and in doing so, gave Anne a kind of rebirth that no royal decree could have granted. Over time, Anne's story grew, not because it was taught, but because it was whispered. In those whispers, she became something larger than her short reign and bloody death. She became a myth of strength, born through injustice, a woman whose legacy could not be buried. And in Elizabeth's shadowed gaze, in her careful silence, in the fire of her rule, Anne Boleyn lived again, not as a victim, but as the ghost in the crown.